Hello and welcome. In this episode, the Ukrainians achieve a big breakthrough in the Kherson front on the other side of the Dnjepr. We are discussing how far they actually are punching south according to the current information and what will that mean for the whole front line. Our favorite pro-Russian channel Ryba is, because of its beautiful maps, is showing that the Ukrainians advance along a fairly broad front south along the Dnepr. We see that here. So we have pictures proving that Kherson and Solota Bailka, something like this, are now liberated by the Ukrainians, and there are big rumors that the Russians are advancing further. Smaller Russian channels are saying it's a difficult situation, is beginning to take shape in the Kherson direction. It is too early to talk about the loss of control of units and unorganized withdrawal. In the coming hours, if no action is taken, the situation could turn into a disaster. And Igor Strelkov, or Girkin, who is a former GRU agent of the Russian military intelligence, he was basically one of the main instigators of the uprising in eastern Ukraine. He is a Russian citizen, Russian military agent who went over there with agents to start the war basically in eastern Ukraine. He's an ultra-nationalist, a fervent, I think the word is, supporter of that war, and wants it to be harder. He was calling for general mobilization for a long time. So he's an ultra-nationalist Russian source. And he is saying, this is the English translation by Google, that the Russian troops are now withdrawing to the village of Duchani. You can pause here if you want to read exactly what else he writes, but Duchani would be here. Now, according to this, they are basically withdrawing all of this line towards Duchani, and that is somewhat important because, as we can see here, Chapinka, I think, is in range. As we can see here, Chapinka from Duchani is more or less 90 kilometers. So it's within range of the HIMARS, and as we can see here, it's along the rail line coming over the Kerch Bridge, basically the main supply route for the Russians when it comes to their western front towards their bridgehead over the Dnepr. This would allow the Ukrainians to shell Chapinka, force the Russians even further back. There's even an airfield here that could be attacked, and this would worsen the supply situation of the Russians on the other side of Kherson if they achieve this. But that's not all. We have further reports now here from Ryba itself. The article, I have the translation here. They are trying to move south along the Dnepr towards Duchani and Berislav. That's here. So Duchani and Berislav is here, but they are just saying they are trying. We have other channels, though, that are saying there is a breakthrough of the armed forces of Ukraine in Berislav right now in Berislav. And this one here is saying, again, you can pause and look it up yourself. The situation in the Kherson direction is very difficult. The enemy is trying to break into Berislav. If Berislav was taken, and I have to spoiler this here, I highly doubt that it is taken as of now. If it was taken and the Ukrainians are not suicidal by pushing down south without sufficient troops to follow up and secure the lines of communication north, that would either mean the loss of those troops here or the immediate withdrawal of all those troops along roughly a line here, because as we can see, the two main lines of communication north are those two roads. Here it is more or less cut at Bruskinske from the Inholets bridgehead south of Davidi Brit. So that one is more or less useless, and should they reach Berislav, it would be useless upwards here too. Now that doesn't mean they can't communicate. There aren't roads anymore. As we can see, there are a lot of side roads that could still be used both for supplies and for retreat. That's not a cauldron at that point yet, but the volume of supply that can reach those troops should be so low that they are either forced to be defeated or they are forced to withdraw immediately and as fast as they possibly could. Now, the big risk, if this was true, was that the Ukrainian would need a massive force behind the spearhead. Pushing down south is theoretically possible. We see it's more or less 70 kilometers, depending on where you see the front is starting, where the push is starting. And here we don't have the full information. We know the Russians have a multi-layered defense system, defense in depth, but for that to be useful, it needs to be manned. Now, if the Russians prepared those lines of defense for the case they are being pushed back, then those are not occupied, which means they are meant that if the front line gets too hot and they have to withdraw their troops, they can withdraw a couple of kilometers and get in pre-prepared defensive lines to stop the Ukrainians at that point again. That is the man-saving option. That is saving combat troops, but that obviously means if the Ukrainians are fast enough, are destroying the frontline troops, are bypassing them, are overrunning them, then there is no one in front of them to stop them. And empty defensive lines are no defensive lines at all. So in that case, a breakthrough along the route south would be possible. Mines or something should not be an issue because as of 24 hours ago, this was a Russian communication line, and you don't mine your own communication line. You mine the front line, you mine where you expect the enemy to be rather soon. So in theory, the Ukrainians could push down, and 70 kilometers is achievable within like 2 hours, more or less, if the opposition isn't too strong. And if they have crushed the frontline troops, then everything they will encounter until the point where actual combat reserves are rushed to engage them, everything they will encounter until then should be backwater troops like logistics, cooks, etc., without real combat value. So in theory, a breakthrough would be possible, but it would be mandatory for the Ukrainians to follow it up with motorized or mechanized troops to prevent the spearhead to being cut off. Obviously, 70 kilometers would allow all those troops a lot of opportunity to push east back towards the Dnepr, cut off that southern advance, and then threaten it with encirclement and complete destruction unless it's reached within a day or two by other Ukrainian forces. So for such an advance to be successful, not only do they need a strong spearhead, they need a strong follow-up force that occupies basically the whole line of communication and then immediately begins to widen it towards the west to create some kind of buffer zone to make sure that even likely Russian counterattacks are not able to push them back towards the road and cut the line of communication. That this is achieved at this point seems to be extremely unlikely, especially as we have the Caucasus War Report here, first reporting that, saying about what is happening in the Russian channels, and then mentioning one of the big Russian Telegram channels saying, this is a video from Berislav, everything's quiet, no fighting here. So that they are currently breaking in Berislav might be too good to be true, so it's probably too good to be true. Regardless of this shows that the Ukrainians are currently on the move. Whether they will be stopped fairly soon or whether they can advance further is too early to tell at this point. But what should be more or less certain that I'm pretty sure they are not in Berislav yet. They might not even have crossed Duchany at this very point. Regardless, a big victory for the Ukrainians, even though Duchany might stop them at another point. What we will see how fast the Russians will be able to solidify new defenses to reorganize and stop the Ukrainians if they keep pushing south. But for that, they would need a strong superiority in manpower to protect their flanks, as I just mentioned. And in this regard, at least more or less all the pro-Russian channels, Telegram channels, are all agreeing with each other that the Ukrainians have massed a massive numerical superiority along the Dnepr reservoir here. So this, at least a further push south, might be a real possibility. We will see what will happen. As of now, the big victory messages might be a little overblown. I don't believe they are actually at Berislav yet. That seems to be almost impossible now. It seems to be almost certain that they are not yet, but they have definitely breached the front line and pushed south on a fairly broad front, and they are, as it seems, still on their way south. But how far they will go, we will only see in a few days. If the situation is changing massively, I will make another short video, another breaking news for you within the coming 2 days. But if it's more or less stable or the advance is fairly slow and there's no massive change, there will be the next situation report on the coming Tuesday. If Berislav is taken though, and that's another thing I should mention here, that would be a massive win for the Ukrainians, not just because of the logistic implications for the Russian advance here, but also because of Novakhovka. Kakhovka. Here, that's one of the main crossing points of the Russians. They are feverishly trying to rebuild the bridge over the Dnepr here, along the Dnepr Dam, which has collapsed in some parts. They did have pontoon bridges here, and they run ferries along this. So this is one of the main crossing points for the Russians to supply their own forces, and it would be in mortar range. And this is important because mortars are fairly cheap, very easy to transport, and their shells are cheap and light. So the Ukrainians should be more or less capable of shelling this crossing site day and night while it is in range of commercial drones, so they can actually correct their artillery, their mortar fire, to make sure it counts and the shells hit where they are supposed to. So should the Ukrainians take Berezslav, then Nova Kakhovka is more or less useless for the Russians at this point. Then all the Russian forces here have to either attack towards the Dnepr reservoir to cut off those, and if they are incapable, then their only chance is to run southwest as fast as they possibly can, while they worsen the whole resupply situation on the right bank of the Dnepr here, because several of the points where they so far used to resupply the whole bridgehead are then no longer are no longer available to the Russians, which should worsen the logistics situation ever further. So we will see how this develops, and if Putin's decision to forbid the military to withdraw will lead to an even bigger disaster, to a much bigger disaster than the Russians have faced in Kharkiv region here towards Kupiansk. But it's too early to say yet. We can just say the Ukrainians have broken through significantly and seem to be on the march as of now. As said, I will keep you updated if there are massive changes along the front line in the coming days. Other than that, you can expect the next situation report the coming Saturday. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. At this point, I want to thank you from my heart to everyone who is already supporting the channel and allowing me to do this. If you also want to support the channel, you find the options for that in the description. Thank you so much for your support, and you can also support the channel by spreading word around, by helping me find more subscribers, by hitting the thumbs up button to tell Google, to tell YouTube that this is a good channel to help me with the algorithm. Leave comments, that's also really helpful. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing, and don't forget the bell button so you don't miss future videos like this. That's it for me now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.